I have tried many different ways of making roads. The method I'm going to show you guys today takes the cake. Absolutely my favorite. I'm building roads this way from now on. Hey everybody, it's Jimmy from the DIY and Digital, and today we're making a road with styrene. This episode is brought to you by Skillshare. Keep watching for an exclusive offer for my subscribers from Skillshare. Originally, I was going to use spackle to make the roads for the layout, and it was going along fairly well until I actually got to the drying point and the sanding point. Once I got everything sanded out as smooth as I could, it had a lot of unevenness and chunks, and I decided to go a different way. I had a few extra sheets of 0.04 inch styrene laying around from when I built the removable buildings, and I said, you know what, I've seen plenty of people use styrene for their streets. Let me give this a shot, and boy, let me tell you, I'm glad I did, but I'll show you the full final result later. Now, I want to be very clear, you don't need any sort of spackle or plaster base to use styrene sheets as your roads. I just happened to try this first method and it didn't work out. So I did have to clean off some of the spackle that I had used, but I ended up leaving most of it in place. Next, I brought in a styrene sheet so that I could make sure that what I had trimmed out will make sure that it sits flush against where the grade crossing is going to go. I'm going to be making my own DIY grade crossing with the styrene sheet, and once I did that, I went ahead and marked out the size of my road where I was going to go to. I kind of know the size and I know roughly where to eyeball it, but if you're looking for a reference, you're looking for about a 2¼ inch size in terms of the width of the road for a 2-lane road in N scale. Now this is going to be a T intersection, and the way that I did this is I brought in one of my squares and I used it to make that perfect 90-degree angle. Now one great thing about this is you're guaranteed to get that good angle, but this also has a slightly rounded edge, so when I make the cut, I've already got the rounded edge built in. And using the square allows you to get the measurements right as well because they're right on the square. Now it's time to cut out the sections that I had outlined. I'm going to be using the scoring and snapping method rather than just cutting straight through. This is the easiest way, if you're using a straight edge like I am, to get nice clean lines on styrene. And basically you just need to make a few scoring lines and then you're going to just snap it off. Styrene's relatively flexible at this thickness and it snaps right off. I do some test fitting and make sure that everything fits, and then I also need to do a few more cuts, but this is kind of a rinse and repeat where I'm now cutting the turn up the hill as well as the section of the road that will go in front of the stretch of buildings that I have. And I have to make sure that I'm not covering up the little gap that I've cut for all of the wiring of those buildings. Once I have cut everything out, I go ahead and test fit it, make sure that it fits properly, and then I go ahead and bring my section of buildings over, sit it on there, make sure that it sits okay. It's obviously not going to sit perfect because I'm not attaching it for the final time, but make sure that's all good, and then I go into cutting more pieces of the styrene. You're going to have seams in this kind of method, but they're pretty easy to cover up. So I go ahead and start taking other pieces of styrene and cutting them to fit, and I do that by marking them and cutting them using that score and snap method. Once I am done with that, I need to go ahead and bring in another sheet of styrene so that I can cut the curved parts of the road. And the first one I'm going to do is actually the uphill section right here. And when I do the cuts, I'm actually going to be freehanding them. This is kind of a nerve-wracking experience, but when you're doing the outer edge of the curve, you want to line it up with the edge of the section you've already cut, and then just kind of go with a firm bit of pressure, but also go fairly quickly so that it keeps the line relatively smooth. You then snap the sections off and double check them for fit. Now, for the grade crossing itself, I actually had a little bit of dumb luck here. The sections that I cut out of the T-intersection were actually the perfect width for the road that's going to be going across the tracks. I just needed to cut out the middle section of the grade crossing so that I could fill it in the track. Now, the important thing when you're making this is to leave enough space for the wheel flanges to pass cleanly through, and make sure that doesn't sit up too high to where it's going to snag a locomotive car or a coupler. And what I did basically was I scored a tiny little mark of where that was, and then I went and scored off that edge and snapped it too. Now, testing this middle insert is very important. The first time I actually tested it, the locomotive snagged on it, so I took a little bit of sandpaper and rubbed off one of the edges, rubbing off just a little bit, just enough so that the flanges could get through. And then the second time I tested it, it did pretty well for not being glued down at all. I did a locomotive across it as well as a rolling stock. You want to make sure that this runs nice and clear so that you're not going to have any issues in the future. Okay, now I have all of my pieces cut and I need to paint them, and I'm going to be using spray paint for this. You guys know how much I love spray paint. And to begin, I'm going to coat them all with a flat gray primer. This is Rust-Oleum's gray primer, and this is because I'm going to be going for kind of a grayish blackish color, kind of a aged asphalt. Usually when you look at a road and you see that a road is black, it's actually not black. It's usually like a very dark gray, and if you're doing concrete, it's going to be regular gray. But you want to make sure that you kind of get one of that you strike that middle ground, and this way, even if I don't paint everything evenly, the primer color is going to take care of some of that gray for me. Now, I let all of that dry before I go with my next coat, which I'm using my classic concrete color, which is Rust-Oleum Aged Gray. It's one of their chalky colors. And you'll notice I'm doing quick burst with rapid hand movements. This is just to get it relatively even, but also a relatively light coat that you can see through to the darker undercoat. So just quick burst, not doing constant, not trying to get an even coat here, just trying to get that more concrete-y, asphalty color. This is going to be a nice undercolor for that, to show that the asphalt is fairly aged and it's been a while since it's been repaved. Now, once I have that done, you can see that I'm taking the pieces that are going to be connected in the end result and I'm lining them up, and then I'm bringing my aged gray in again. I'm doing streaks across the edges and the seams, and this is so that when they line up, they look like they are all one section with maybe a big crack and some splits and some seams in them. And now for the third color, it's going to give it a more asphalt look. I'm using just a small can of black spray paint. This is some flat black spray paint. You'll notice that I'm using the same technique that I used with the aged gray. And basically this is going to give it that uneven look, that weathered look, and this is going to make it a lot easier if you need to do any sort of other weathering on this road. And this is also going to give it that grayish blackish mixed texture that you typically see on older asphalt roads. You can also see that I'm using the same technique of having the pieces lined up so that the seams look like they're one continuous piece with some cracks in them, rather than having them look different and have them not matched up. This is a simple trick that really works well. Now, once everything has dried, I'm able to bring it back up to the layout and go ahead and start lining up the pieces, making sure that everything looks okay, and if I need to do any other painting, because the next step is we're going to go ahead and glue this. Now, I'm just going to be using some simple white glue for this. No need to use anything fancier. I'm sure some of you have used other glues for this type of thing, but to me, the white glue works great for this, and I'm just going to continue with using that product. Once I'm done with that, I go ahead and weigh down all the roads and let them dry. Now, if you watch my most recent layout update, if you haven't, I'll link it here, I put down a gravel path for an industry that's going to be put on at a later date, and I also blended it with this road that was already done during that particular episode. But what I didn't show is that I was actually using that gravel as the edge of the road, the little bit of extra right-of-way right there. And the way I basically did that was I ran a bead of glue along the edge of the road and simply just spread the gravel there, and then did it like I was doing the roadbed for some track. I sprinkled it along and then neatened it up with a brush. This method not only hides the edge of the styrene, but it's going to make it easier to blend in other scenery once I put it in with the road itself, and it's going to make everything look a bit more natural and the way that it is supposed to be. Once that was done, I soaked it with some 70% IPA and then ran some scenic cement along it just to glue it down in place. Again, it's very similar to the process of ballasting track. Very, very similar to it. Now I'm going to be painting some of the markings on the road, and what I'm going to be starting with is the little stop lines that are either at an intersection or in this case are at a grade crossing. And what I'm basically doing here is I'm going to be masking off the sections. I've measured the halfway point of the road, so I left roughly 25 millimeters. I was using millimeters because it's a little bit easier than doing the quarters and eighths and sixteenths of an inch. And I basically measured those, and then I just kind of eyeballed how straight they were. And once I had everything stenciled out, I used a foam brush. And the reason that I used a foam brush is I really needed to do more of a dabbing technique to be able to get this nice and even. If you're using a regular bristle brush, you're going to have some brush strokes in there. So using that foam brush makes it a lot easier to get that even coat. Plus you can use the flat edges of the brush to make that coat nice and even. Get a little bit better idea of me using that nice even dabbing technique versus using a bristle brush, and you can really see how even the paint is. It takes a little bit more effort to get the paint off, but in the end you're going to have a nice even coat that has no brush strokes on it, which is key to getting these lines right. If you're really careful, you can actually save this section of painter's tape to use as a stencil, and I was actually able to do that with this section. I decided to try and pull this off nice and slowly, and surely enough it came up, and I was able to stencil another one of these little stop lines. Now, for the yellow lines that I'm going to put in between, I'm doing pretty much the exact same technique, except for the yellow lines, I'm only making them 1 millimeter wide. And I need to line them up with the middle section right here between these two stop lines. Now you will notice that I'm giving a good rub to those pieces of painter's tape once I am done, and that is because I want to make sure that there is a good seal right there so I don't have any paint leakage. Now for this particular yellow, I'm using kind of a faded yellow color. You don't want to use a bright yellow or like a neonish yellow for these lines. You'll notice in the real world they're actually kind of they lean a little bit more towards the yellow, orange, golden color. So you want to use a color like that when you are blending this in. Now once again, it is the exact same technique you've seen me use for the stop lines. It's just using that dab technique to make sure that the lines are nice and even. Now, while that is all drying, I go ahead and do more lines. You'll notice that I'm doing one line at a time. I'm not doing both the lines simultaneously. This is so I can let one dry, make sure it's good, and then line up the second line on it. And the reason that I'm doing that is because you want these lines to look as real as possible, and you need to make sure that they are even. So if you let the line dry and you're able to take the stencil off, it makes it a lot easier to align that second line if you're doing a double yellow line. Another thing that you will see me do right here is tape over a middle section of the line, and this is basically just me taping over where will be the intersection of the little T intersection where the cars will be able to come and go freely. As you guys know, typically when you have an intersection like that, you don't have the lines running through it, so that's what I'm doing right here. And then it's literally just the same process over and over again. If you haven't gotten a theme by doing model railroad scenery like this, it is a lot of rinse and repeat, especially when you're doing the base level where you have a lot of the same things. So you're just going to keep doing the same process over and over again and adjusting it for each situation. When you're doing the second line, the only thing I'll say is that it's exactly the same, except for when you're taping it down, make sure that you put down the outer line first so that you can see and align with the first line that you have painted. Otherwise, it's the exact same process. Now you can see here that I had some slight unevenness with the edges and the ends of the lines, and rather than taking a brush and trying to do it, I actually used a bamboo skewer and just used the tiny little point to even out the spaces. It's not perfect, but it ends up drying okay and it looks pretty good, and it's just a very easy way to control the paint and fix it quickly. Now it's time for the curved roads that I'm going to line for. The other section of curved road I'm not, because it's just a road leading to an industry, but this one I need to make some reference points, and I do this using my hobby knife, and I just make some tiny marks in the road that I'm going to use to guide when I am taping the lines down. Now for this particular set, I'm going to be doing a single dashed line for this road, so I'm going to only need one stencil when I end up doing this. The one thing that you see me doing here is I am simply using the millimeter side right there to make sure that I get right in the middle of each, because the road does sort of taper up to the top. Now this is probably the toughest part of the whole taping job, and basically what I'm doing here is I'm kind of having to work the tape into a curve, and I'm using those little marks that I made as a reference point. And again, I'm making the line 1 millimeter wide, and I kind of guide it into the edge of the straight edge that I've put as the tape coming up from the city town area. And then once again, I'm just kind of eyeballing this and making sure that I get everything nice and even. I will say that the outer side of the curve is a bit more difficult than the inner side of the curve, and you just got to be patient and make sure you work it through, and then run your finger a lot to make sure that that edge is pressed down. Now it's time to do the dotted lines of the road itself. Now, a lot of people don't realize how long those dashes are on the road when you have a broken line like that. So they're actually pretty long. You're just driving by them fairly fast. And what I'm using for reference is actually the width of the painter's tape. I know this isn't exact and it's probably wrong in terms of the scale, but it actually looks fairly correct. And so what I'm doing basically is I'm using the width of the painter's tape, getting a rough mark, and then putting it down that tape. You can definitely be more exact, but it ended up working out fairly well and getting the marks right and nice and fairly even. Then it was time to paint. I'm using that same yellow paint, and I'm using the same technique as before, just that dab technique, just a little bit less of it, and I'm only hitting the spots, obviously, that they are stenciled out. And once this is done, I'm able to peel the tape off, and I actually did this all the way down to the intersection that is right there. Now, one cool thing about the acrylic paint is that if you mess up on this particular surface, you can actually trim it out and cut away the excess once it has dried. And this actually worked out very well in my favor. Now, one thing that the painter's tape did was pull up a few spots of paint from the original coat, but I'm just going to make these into potholes, and this is very easy to do. I'm just going to take a Sharpie and color in the spots, and this makes it look a bit more realistic. Now, when I do color them in, I also add a little bit of a jagged edge and some unevenness just to make it look a bit more natural. But this is a great way to cover up some of those spots, and even if you don't have the spots, you might want to add some detail like this. It's really easy to do with a Sharpie. Now, one thing you'll see here is the seam between the two pieces of styrene. A really easy way to make this look a bit more realistic is simply to take the Sharpie and draw right along the seam. This makes it look like they filled it in with some tar, some patch, just to fill in a seam that had cracked along two sections of the road. Now, when you do this, make sure you make it look a little bit uneven, nothing crazy, but just kind of have some bulging sides or some little wiggles and things like that when you draw it out. Another thing you can do with the Sharpie is you can just make some little cracks where it looks like they've put some patch material on those cracks, and you just gotta kind of lightly go over the area where you're doing it and just kind of draw some nice little squiggly lines that look like cracks. And you don't have to go crazy with it, but adding some cracks like that and then maybe adding some weathering to it would look really good. Now it's time to attach the buildings into their final position. Now, I told you that this is a removable section, which is precisely why I am using white glue, and I'm not using a ton of white glue. I'm literally dabbing the corners. This way, if I just apply a decent amount of pressure, it's going to pop right off, but it's also going to sit flush from where I glued it. And basically, that's exactly what I want here. I want this to look as realistic as possible, but be easily removable. And I'm going to use some of my 3-2-1 blocks to be able to weigh this down. These are great multi-tools for model railroading. If you haven't checked them out, I'll link some in the description below, but these are really great for weighing down everything and letting it dry. And I'm going to let it dry longer than I typically would white glue. Now, I ended up following my rule of when in doubt, let it dry overnight for this, which probably wasn't necessary, but the end result was pretty good. Next, it was time to do some of the gravel right-of-way edging of the road on this side. I'm not going to go over this completely again, obviously, because I've already done it, but just know that I'm doing this little spot, and I'm not doing a ton extra because I'm still working on the crossing system for this, so I'm not going to be detailing the area right around the track, but it's pretty much the exact same process as before, where I just put some gravel down, spread it out, and then brush it in place nicely, very similar to doing roadbed. Now, for the area behind the buildings, this isn't going to be a heavily seen area, but I still want to have some scenery on it. I'm doing a gravel lot, gravel pad that's going to connect to the edging that I'm doing on the road that goes up the hill. So I'm going to be doing it a lot like I do any other scenery. I just need to blend the back edge of the concrete on the buildings with the scenery that I'm doing. So I'm just going to be spreading it out and then spraying the gravel like I did with the gravel lot for the industry over there. Very simple, very straightforward. And then once we get to the road itself, then it's going to get a little bit tricky. What I have to do there are some hills and some little gaps, and basically I have to fill it up like you see when they pile dirt or gravel to support a road that's going over a gap. So you're going to have a bit bigger of some edging, a bit deeper, a bit wider edging on parts of the road right there. Next up, it was time to secure everything in place. And for that, I'm doing the standard applying IPA to release the surface tension, and then doing my scenic cement mixture. Now, this is actually where I probably made a pretty big oopsie right here, and you're going to see me make it here in a minute. I've soaked the roads just by the fact that they are near everything, and I'm going to go ahead and place my glue, but then you're going to see me start to wipe the glue and the IPA off the road, particularly the upward curved section. And what I didn't think about is how great of a cleaner IPA can be, and it kind of wiped all of my road lines off from the section where I wiped it. So I ended up having to go in and repaint the lines. Not a huge deal at this point, just made sure everything was nice and dry before I did that, and it ended up working out fine. I actually think the lines look a little better. Okay, before we get to the final reveal of the roads, I want to talk about our sponsor, Skillshare, because they are absolutely awesome. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of inspiring classes for creators to explore new skills, deepen existing passions, and get lost in creativity. There are all sorts of courses that you can try there, including ones with painting and other crafts that will help you out model railroading, as well as learning things like Arduino. And if you want to learn more about doing videography or photography for your model railroad, you can check out classes for those too. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, which means that there are no ads, and they're always adding new premium classes so that you can stay focused on wherever your creativity takes you. And right now, the first 1,000 of my subscribers that click the link in the description below will get a month free trial of Skillshare so that you can start exploring your creativity today. All right, let's check out these roads. I really love them. Of all the methods I've used to build a road, this one checks the most boxes. It looks the best in my opinion. It is the easiest to install, it is the simplest to paint and detail, and it's pretty easy to make custom grade crossings as well compared to other methods. So I'm really happy with the styrene road method. It's my new go-to for all of these. I know many of you have probably built a road out of styrene before, but I really love the way that this turned out. If you want to see some of the other ways that I've made roads, I'll link those videos at the end of this video. I do want to say a big thank you to this video's sponsor, Skillshare. They made this video possible, so check them out at the link in the description below. I also want to say a huge thank you to all of my patrons. They're listed right here. You can become a patron for as little as $1 a month. A lot of cool stuff going on over there, including a model of the month at the $5 a month level that you can 3D print yourself. And again, check out those videos if you want to check out some other methods of building roads. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, and happy railroading. Methods I've done. Thank you to all of my patrons. They're listed right here. You can